Hey y'all, welcome back to the Greg Brownderville Dimension. This is a show about the magic of language. Today our guest is Johnny Wink, who is one of my favorite poets and just one of my favorite people. Johnny and I met when I was still in high school. We struck up a correspondence, and then when it came time for me to go off to college, I was trying to decide where I was going to go, and I went and visited the university where Johnny then taught and still teaches, a very good school in Arkadelphia, Arkansas called Ouachita Baptist University. And when I went and visited, we sat in a room called the Pretty Room and talked for a good long while, and he won me over, and I thought, this is the place where I'm going to go to college, and it is where I went, had a wonderful time. Well, we recorded this podcast in that same room where he and I had our very first face-to-face conversation, the Pretty Room. Johnny is a beloved professor. He's the author of two poetry books, one called Haunting the Wine Runner and one called 7 Ways to Prune a Grapefruit. I highly recommend these books if you can get your hands on them. Two of my favorites. One thing that will come up in the conversation is that Johnny's office is full of photos. I mean, the walls are just covered with photographs and just strange pieces of paper with all kinds of little odds and ends on them, little pieces of writing. We mentioned one of Johnny's colleagues named Randall White, whom Johnny nicknamed Cake the Wizard. And I should say that Johnny's late wife, Susan, who was also one of my teachers at Ouachita, comes up in conversation, and his son Gene as well is mentioned on several occasions. In this podcast, we talk about the joys and perils of a storyteller's having a zany streak, and Johnny and I are both storytellers with a zany streak. We talk about the bluesman, Mississippi Fred McDowell, and the unifying power of music. We talk about the fun and the significance of local mythologies, the kinds of myths we make up about the places where we spend our lives. We talk about some of the secrets to creating a joyful classroom. Johnny, after all, has been teaching for several decades and is a marvelous teacher. We talk about the best ways to seek, receive, and benefit from constructive criticism. We talk about why listening is both delightful and good for the world. We talk about the central role that language, that words play in creation myths. Another topic that gets broached is the spiritual importance of getting outside ourselves. We discuss also the magic of physical beauty and weird love, Flannery O'Connor style. But without further ado, here is a conversation between me and the one and only Johnny Wink. Johnny, I remember you telling me a story some years ago about your having been a part of a crew that got a private concert from Fred McDowell. How exactly did that come about?
Just as irony would have it, this boy from the Mississippi Gulf Coast goes to graduate school in Fayetteville and makes good friends with a boy from up in Quincy, Illinois. And which of the two of them happened to know about the blues, the boy from Quincy, Illinois. So in the course of my getting to know Wayne McGinnis, he really was my education. It didn't come from growing up in Mississippi. I mean, the closest I got to the blues in Mississippi would be like people like James Brown. You know, I did grow up listening to James Brown. But Mississippi John Hurd, I knew nothing about him. So Wayne, being a real savant, who educated me and many a wonderful bluesman, happened to know that Fred McDowell lived in a place about 70 miles south of Memphis called Como, Mississippi. And actually, as it turned out, when we found him, lived in a house behind a classical old big house, you know, in which some white people lived. Wayne, I forget how Wayne learned that he was there, and he sure didn't have an address. But we did find our way down to Como and asked around and located. At the time, my brother and sister-in-law by my first marriage were in Memphis, and Jack Butler and Lanice Butler and I had gone with Wayne to visit them in Memphis. We were all in Fayetteville. And so one day we just made an exploratory trip into Mississippi, found out he did indeed live in this place, talked to his wife, learned he had gone to the wrestling that night in Memphis, but that he'd be back the next day. We told her what we were up to. We went back the next day and we fetched him back to Memphis and told him we'd pay him what we could. He didn't even ask for a price. We just said we'd put together everything we've got. And he gave us, in essence, a private audience. He sat up there with, I'll bet until midnight or afterwards. And then we took him back, or Wayne and Jack and Doug took him back. I remember I stayed there in Memphis with Brenda and Lenice. But what I told you last time, and the thing that's most moving about all this, is that Brenda brought a young man, a black man, who certainly had a different view of the world from Fred McDowell. And Brenda even worried that there might be tension between the old man and the young man and the whole specter of being an Uncle Tom. And in any event, it didn't happen because of music. Music was the great bridge, and McDowell got to playing. The young man got with the spirit, pulled out his harmonica, and at one point, said, "Play it, Father," or "Sing it, Father," one of the two. And I just felt like that was, I've heard lots in my life, about how music can act, as a great diplomat, in the world and can bring us together. That was the most dramatic example I ever had of it in the flesh,
What a beautiful, I love it. "Sing it, Father." What a line.
Yeah, man. It was just, it's one of those things, I think back on it and I think, am I embroidering that? Did he really say that? Maybe, but I don't think so. I'm certainly telling it as a supposed truth. I'm almost sure that happened. I don't think I could have made that up, actually, but I wouldn't anyway, because I'm trying to tell you the truth about what happened that night. And it was just, man, yeah.
Fred McDowell. I love his music.
Yeah. And I think I also mentioned to you that it was some years later that he got the epithet Mississippi, applied to him. He was, as far as Wayne knew, and I knew, and Wayne knew all about his, the history of his recordings up to then, but he was Fred McDowell. And then somebody laid that Mississippi on him, just like somebody somewhere along the line did that with John Hurt. Yeah.
I read a piece about Fred McDowell in the Oxford American many years ago, in which the writer said that he had the kind of angular good looks that last into old age. I remember that was one of the observations about him. But he
certainly seemed to me attractive, yeah.
I like how he would drone that bass note, stay on like if he's playing in the key of E, he would just keep droning that E note. Even when in the Delta blues, you would go to the A chord and you'd switch bass notes to A. A lot of times, Fred McDowell, he would just keep droning that low E or whatever it was, G, whatever key he was playing in. Right. It gave the music this kind of eerie feeling to it that I enjoy. Right. And I hear that in a lot of what they call hill country.
Yeah, you mentioned that distinction when we got to talking about Junior Kimbrough too. Yeah.
Johnny, when you were saying, I don't think I embellished that. It reminded me when I was in grad school, I was a TA, a teaching assistant, and the lead lecturer was a professor who was talking about storytelling one day in the big lecture with 120 students in there. And he said, you know how you start embellishing a story somewhere along the way, and every time you tell it, it gets a little bit better, and years later you're still telling it, and there's something here that goes beyond facticity,
right?
But you don't really know anymore
that's exactly on the point there. I really do believe. I mean, if we could access the mind of God, and I could know that, I'd put my money on the guys either having said "Sing it, Father," or "Play it, Father." One of the two. I would put my money on that, but maybe with a little fear and trembling, because I don't. Because we do that in the nature of things,
It reminds me of a friend of mine named Jerry Nelson used to talk about this, and he said that a good story that you tell over and over is like a river rock that's smoothed with retellings.
Yeah, yeah.
But it reminds me of something that your late wife Susan said about you, because you love to memorize poems and recite poems and say poems. And she said that when you make a mistake, and I'm putting this in air quotes, in her view of it, what you were actually doing is editing the poem. Do you think there's something to that?
I do. And I talk to my students about that. I say, like when we read aloud in creative writing, I say, if you misread the thing, that may just be a simple misreading. But it always does well to say, well, you substituted another word there. Let's wonder together whether that might not be the better word. Because I do think that can be edited, and that's what I think Susan was right about that. It's funny too, I will sometimes not have gone back and looked at the text of a poem for a long time, and I'll have been reciting it though out on the Feaster Trail and all forever, and I go back and I'm shocked because there will be a word that I would have sworn was the word that was in the text. And sometimes it doesn't at all feel to me like a change for the better, but I got it in my head that was the word. And boy, it can be a real shock. There's a story I always like to tell about having to do with you, because I think it makes a really important point about how we respond to each other's writing and editorial capacities, What I say is the ideal writer who is looking for a reader to read and comment on his work is the writer who really doesn't just want a pat on the back, He really does want suggestions. And that's the one thing that's got to be there. You've got to genuinely want help. And the other thing, though, is you can't be slavish about it. You can't have as your reader somebody you're just going to say, oh, that's my editor. He's got to be right about this. And I use you as an exemplar. I said back years ago when Greg would send me work of his just to comment on and make suggestions about, I always loved the way he did that because he was very respectful. He would take my suggestions into his mind and really think about them. So he was respectful. He was not a person who would get ruffled because, oh, he's trying to change me. That wasn't it at all. But also Greg would make the decision. And I said, I always tell my students, the ball's back in your court. And now it's your turn. You're the one to make, and I've actually stopped in creative writing. I don't give grades anymore. Like A's, B, I have quizzes and ways of figuring out a grade. But I just decided I don't mind giving a freshman essay a grade or other things. But I just came to a point a couple of years ago where I didn't want to any longer give grades to efforts in my creative writing class. So I don't. And I'm glad to be free of that. And but that's a long time coming. I mean, it took me way long to get to that. And maybe it's not a good idea, but then my point is to go back to the court, and the classic example for me is a line where I voted for your adding a line of yours in one of my favorite poems of yours. When I voted for your adding a word, and the line was for the way it read when you sent it to me was for the left side of her nose. Lost to cancer. And what I wanted you to do was put in a now for the left side of her nose, now lost to cancer. And I call it the problem of now. And the point I make is, I believed in that now, and I submitted it to Greg, and he respectfully declined it, and he left it out. And I said, I have a weird little, it's almost like a moral dilemma, except the stakes are so small that it isn't really. But if I'm going out on Feaster Trail and I come in my cycle of poems to never, I go back and forth. I mean, I'm not saying it to anybody but the birds and God, and sometimes I stick the now in and sometimes I keep it out. And I said that for me, the real moral dilemma would be if I recited that in public. And I said, and I know what I would do. I would leave it out. That's the way Greg wanted it. But I feel like I've got the luxury on the Feaster Trail of having it be nowful or nowless, right?
Absolutely, yeah. That's thinking about that relationship between editing poems that way and changing stories that you tell is interesting. It makes me think of this time when I was telling a story for my family, just for entertainment, and probably around Thanksgiving this time of year, and I knew that I was changing some things around, and I was doing it to make the story a little bit better. But my mother was there, and she wants you to be accurate when you're telling stories.
Right.
And as I was telling this, I started feeling this. I had a premonition that, okay, when I get to this one part, I'm going to switch these facts around, and Mama's going to call me on it. And sure enough, she did. And I thought about this. It made me think about this story I read in Roy Foster's biography of Yeats. He tells that, and I may be mangling the story, but the way I remember it is that Yeats was giving some kind of little talk or something, and he said, well, there's not much good that can be said of the Protestant Reformation except that it led to the Renaissance. And this guy who was there kind of sheepishly spoke up and said, Mr. Yeats, I think that went the other way around. Wasn't the Renaissance before the Reformation? And without missing a beat, Yeats said, look at O'Brien here. He's the sort of fellow who would knock the Archangel Gabriel out of full flight with the brickbat of fact.
Oh, that's great. That's right. That's great.
And I do see something of that in Yeats, that it doesn't bother him one bit to mangle things, sacrifice everything, logic, historical accuracy, good sense, anything, to make something more interesting or more beautiful to his imagination.
Right. I remember something of his, I don't know where this occurs in his writing, but he's talking about science, and he has this image of science as a ship. And he said, every once in a while, this gay boat of science sets out upon the sea again, with its newly intact, newly built, with the new ideas, the ones that are forever true now, only to be wrecked once again on the shoals of the mystery of the universe. But I love that idea that science setting out again, we got it right this time. Bringing up Yeats, I had written a few things down here on this piece of paper, to things that I might bring up when we talk today. And you just reminded me of something nifty regarding Frost and Yeats. I have a friend in Oregon named Judy Alexander, and she's a very big fan of Yeats. And we played a game at some point where what we would do is she would send me a poem by Yeats, and I would say whether it was in my top 20. I would just try to think, well, is this a top 20 poem for me? And then I'd send her one. And what we were trying to do is we were coming up with the 20 greatest Yeats poems by Judy and Johnny's reckoning. But the idea would be there would be more than 20 in the nature of things, because we wouldn't agree on all of them. And so there would be one that would be on her list, but I'd say, well, it doesn't quite make mine. But that reminded me of an argument that I got into with Jay. Jay Curlin is a great fan of both Frost and Yeats. But Jay has a strong belief that Yeats should be rated greater because he says, and this is the way the game came about, he said, so you can tell me the name of a Frost poem, and I'll say, yeah, in my view, that's a great poem. And then I say a Yeats, and we go back and forth, and Johnny submits the Frosts, and Jay submits the Yeats. And Jay feels sure that if you do that, and we did in fact do it, we will get at a point when I've run out of great Frost poems, but there will be more Yeats. But here was the problem. The problem was, as you might expect it would be, it was ultimately down to taste. Because after we got beyond a certain point, Jay wasn't conceding. I would say poem X by Frost, and Jay'd say, no, there's a falling off there. And so we really couldn't come to any agreement. Jay will continue to believe that Yeats has more poems that can be classified as great than Frost, and I'll continue to believe otherwise. A poem that I think is great and that Susan thought was great, and Jay never saw it. And actually, there was even a little rancor here. Because Susan and Jay kind of bristled at each other, I think, about this. But Jay then wrote the most wonderful takeoff, and I'll also send you that. the poem that Susan and I like so much is the poem by Merwin called Elegy, that just has one line. He says, "Who would I show it to?" And the reason Susan and I were moved by it was for us, it got to the heart of something. And that is, the way you could be so overcome with sorrow that, you wouldn't be able to write an elegy. Because the person you'd most want to read it, is the one who's died. And so you put the title down, Elegy, who would I show it to? And that just knocked Susan for a loop and knocks me for a loop. But it just didn't resonate for Jay. It didn't work for him. So he then wrote a poem that starts the same thing. He says, "Who would I show it to?" And then when he goes, "Holly's in jail." Da-da-da-da-da. And he then goes, all the people he can't show it to because they're either in jail or dead or something. It's just wonderful.
One story I was thinking about that I would love for you to tell is the by now famous amongst our friends story of what is it, Frankenstein in Las Vegas, milkshakes and love or something like that?
That really, and once again, I don't think I'm embroidering this. And I've been, ever since that happened, I've tried everywhere to find in my own writing a home, for that story. Like write it as a poem. I write along with my writing classes, so I've written it as a story. And I never can figure out how to do it the justice that it deserves to be done. But the way it went was my brothers and I were in Las Vegas. We were traveling around, going to national parks out there. And my only time in Las Vegas, we were at the Golden Nugget. And I liked playing poker. So I and my brother Richard were in a poker game. And on my right, there was sitting a guy. And these are both kind of seedy-looking characters. And one of them looked like an old comedian who was seedy enough looking already, but this was like an even seedier-looking version, a comedian named Don Rickles, a kind of a no-holds-barred comedian. So, kind of balding guy, not very attractive, and this guy wasn't either. The other guy was kind of taller, and he looked like Frankenstein's monster to me. I mean, like the way Boris Karloff played him, And they were flanking me, if I'm remembering correctly, and I'm sitting here in the game. And it was clear they knew each other. And but it was also clear that they were kind of sniping at each other, so they weren't anything violent, but they obviously were either mad at each other or that was just the nature of their relationship, to kind of, snipe at each other and get on each other's nerves. So one of the guys decided that he was going to get out of the game, Frankenstein's monster. And the other guy just looked up at him and said, "Go get me a goddamn chocolate milkshake." And Frankenstein over here saying, "I ain't going to go get you any goddamn chocolate milkshake." Once again, if I'm remembering it rightly, the guy repeats, says, "Go get me a goddamn chocolate milk." And the guy left. And I didn't think I'd ever see the guy again. And then later, not too long, he comes in and hands this guy, I don't remember words being exchanged, despite his protestations that he wasn't going to get him a goddamn chocolate milkshake. He did. And then he left. And I guess I was kind of like a Flannery O'Connor mood came on me, where it's like, since she obviously was all about trying to show how people could express love for each other in bizarre ways. And that's why it felt kind of like that to me, like something I would experience in her writing. And it just stayed with me all through the years, yeah.
He had a lot on the line there because he had sort of publicly, to the extent that this poker table was a public space,
absolutely
said, kind of laid down the law, said, "I'm not going to do that."
No, and it wasn't even as if his doing it, there was no explicit reconciliation. It wasn't like, "Hey, thanks, man, I'm sorry I was late." It's just a handoff of the milkshake, as if I'm getting it right, yeah.
Did you get the idea they were, you probably couldn't even tell, but did they seem to be friends, lovers, or brothers? I couldn't
tell. That I didn't really have a sense. Was this a sexual thing? or not. I really never, but I did, what was strong to me was the idea that, you can really love somebody. I mean, the way I always wanted to write it up was something like a person sitting and pondering, had I seen the manifestation of the real thing, because I mean, like with Flannery O'Connor, that's the linchpin for me of her writing is the notion that love, since she was a believer, and believed in this thing called love and this author of love called God, that it was going to manifest. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. And she believed the world was charged with the grandeur of God. And she went about in her own idiosyncratic way trying to hint at that, And I mean, that's to me is one of the great aspects of her power, is that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I remember when you told me about this, and I was so enticed because you said, Greg, because I was coming to town, and you were emailing me. You said, when you come to town on Thursday, I've got something for you. I'm going to tell you a story about Frankenstein's monster, Don Rickles, Las Vegas, chocolate milkshakes, and love.
I know that's the way down through the years I thought about that. That, yeah, man, that might be the real thing. As unpretty as it is, as unromantic as it is, and that's Flannery O'Connor with all of these grim, gruesome things. Yet she's saying to us, man, there's love somewhere in all of this.
I was thinking back on some stories you told me through the years, and one that I think struck you as unbelievable at the time and still feels that way to me. I mean, I believe that it happened, but it's shocking.
Right.
It's one of your in truth stories that involves Mothra.
Oh, yes. Yeah. I remember that vividly. It's just that since Susan and Jean were going to have to spend a lot of time around me, and since I can't help, telling all kinds of things, their fail-safe, their safe word, in a sense, was in truth. And, if they said in truth, I was morally obligated to come clean about something I was fabricating. And, they prided themselves on the fact that they would get to know me well enough. They didn't have to resort to that. They knew when I was, just messing around. I remember Susan one time getting kind of mad at somebody. I was telling this weird story about how a friend of mine named Jeff Pounders went out. I'm just making all of this up, Greg, but Jeff Pounders was in sociology here and was a really good guy. And he didn't do, none of this happened. But I said, yeah, Jeff, some years ago, he went for an interview with, for a job at a college in Idaho. And it said it didn't go very well because the guy that picked him up at the airport was very, very nice. And but they went to a restaurant and he ordered something. And the waitress said, sir, will you have that with or without sowder? Just making up that word, S-O-W-D, with or without sowder, at which point...
How would you spell it?
S-O-W-D-E-R is the way I saw it. Just invented it. And at the time I told the story, I would have known what he'd ordered, but it was something, and which wouldn't make a bit of difference because sowder doesn't exist as far as I know. And the waitress just said very sweetly, with or without sowder, sir. Well, up to now, all Jeff had seen was a nice guy who had picked him up at the airport. But this guy then looks at her and says, with or without sowder, them's fighting words. And they got in a fist fight, the waitress and the guy. And Jeff then had to scuttle his plans. He didn't get the job interview because this guy went ballistic in a restaurant. And it was no big thing. But, at some point, I didn't even tell this to Susan. She just said, stop wasting my time. But I mentioned telling this story to somebody, some friend of ours, and how I really had this person going. And Susan really did get kind of just disgusted and said, I can't believe anybody who knows you would would have believed a thing like that, you know. So with Susan and Jean, I had to really be great. And on those few occasions when I was able to elicit an in-truth from them, my mission, my work was done, you know. I'd gotten them to do that. Well, David Strain lived with us on and off on a couple of occasions. Once he had an assistantship in Fayetteville, and it didn't require him to be there. He'd finished his courses, and he came down and lived with us. And so he hung around a lot, and so he got in on the in-truth thing. And when Everett Slavens, there was a scandal involving Everett when he left his wife for a woman much younger. And he was supposed to have a confrontation with then President Ben Elrod.
This was a professor at the time.
Yeah. And he was a history professor whose nickname was Godzilla. And so I said one night to David Strain, David and Susan, all of us knew there was going to be a big meeting where Everett would go over to then a building that no longer exists, but where the president was. And I said, I don't know what went on at the meeting, but I have it on good authority that when Elrod showed up today, he wasn't driving. And they said, why not? And said, well, he got somebody from the university to drive him because he had to sit in the back. He was wearing these Mothra wings in order to, for some reason, I never thought of Elrod as a zany guy, but he wore these Mothra wings since he was going to have this, interview with Godzilla. Well, that's the kind of thing, nobody's going to believe that, And I just tell it, not trying to get somebody to believe it, because nobody ever would. And David looked at me and said, in truth. And it was like in a moment of weakness, David really had to know, well, we tease David to this day. If I see David, I tease him about that. And he admits that he did it. He said, I don't know why. I don't know why all of a sudden I needed to get you to say that to make me realize that wasn't true. I knew it wasn't true, but something in me thought, but what if it was? So that was his great in-truth moment, weakness moment.
And you had given him the nickname Godzilla, right?
Yeah.
And that's something you've done down through the years on the campus where you teach, right? It's just giving everybody a nickname.
And because I persist, a lot of times they stick. A funny thing happened years ago. I'd been here probably 10 or 15 years when this happened, but I'd already started in on that. And I was writing things and sending them around campus, creating this mythology, and naming people, writing up stories, And a woman came, an anthropologist came to give a lecture one time. And she gave her lecture, and then she had an audience with the faculty, just in the faculty lounge to talk. And she starts saying, this is not something everybody realizes, but no matter what your environment is, no matter what your work, it really is important and valuable, although not everybody knows this. And she clearly seemed to think we didn't know it. You've really got to build up a mythology. You've got to get to telling. And after a while, she saw everybody grinning at her, and she smiled and said, "Oh, I guess that's already happened here." And yes, it has,
It enchants the campus, I've always thought. All those nicknames and the story. I mean, you had named one of my favorite professors on campus, Cake the Wizard. And I remember asking you, where did that come from, Dr. Wink? And you said, I don't know.
Do you know, I have a dear friend right now. Her name is Bailey Alexander. She worked in our department and is the daughter of Tom Alexander, who had been a student of mine years ago. And even though Bailey and I she was never in a class of mine, but we've really become very, very close. And every Sunday, we have a Zoom session at noon. And she's up in Northwest Arkansas, and she Zooms in, and we spend an hour shooting a breeze. And Bailey was one who wanted to ask, and did ask while she was here, about every single picture in my office. She was just hungry to know. And I would tell her about Cake the Wizard, and she went on a quest to try to find out why he was named that. And since I never did there was no good reason for that. But she actually got to be friends and is now good friends with Randall because of that. And that all started with her questing over there and asking him about Cake the Wizard,
What are some? Could you just list some that you remember? These nicknames you've come up with.
And one time I actually wrote out a list. I was thinking about, turnabout's fair play, and so I've got a lot of nicknames myself, and some of them I may be known to this person, to one person by this name, and some other one maybe 5. But to give you an example of my friend Beth Polo, when she came into my life as a student of mine in the 70s, pretty soon after I began knowing her, I called her Paloma, the Spanish for dove. And the reason I did that was that she was a kind of a hippie girl, peaceable, gentle, but very feisty, had a lot of Irish in her too, but really wanted to be peaceful and friends with people. And she once gave me a wonderful cup, a white cup with blue writing on it, and it had in many, many languages and many alphabets and non-alphabets the word for peace. And I eventually broke it, and I've got it at my house on my kitchen table. We always look at it when she comes and visits me, one last shard that's got, some little remnant of the word peace in some language. And then Beth, back when I first knew her, she didn't dress like a hippie. She tried to dress, but she gave herself away. It was just something about her looks. And one thing that helped give it away was she wore patchouli. And so patchouli, then I looked up that word and where it came from, and it came from I forget the name of the language, the one that's spoken in Tamil in Sri Lanka. And it turns out that patchouli is a blend of words for green and leaf. And so Beth got another nickname, the patchouli or the green leaf kid. And that was the second nickname I gave her, and she liked both of them, Paloma and the green leaf kid. And then after Susan died and Beth came into my life a little more frequently, we still don't see much of each other, but she visits once in a while and we write, and the nicknames have just kind of blossomed. She likes spiders, and we've had all sorts of neat little coincidences. Sometimes I'll see a spider spinning a web, and the next thing I know, I hear from her. So she's now the spider goddess. And this is how it's gone, I have certain friends of mine have gotten more nicknames, say that I just longevity. Mm-hmm. Some not. I mean, I'm close to Cake the Wizard as I can be, but he's just Cake the Wizard for me.
I remember the Emperor of Ice Cream,
Doug,
the White
and that
Rabbit.
one was for no good reason, really. That was just, of course, you and I have played that too with Our Stained and
mm-hmm.
Gab and Great Wink of Eternity. And, you like to play around.
Mm-hmm.
I do that with Alex Taylor now, picking up on his calling himself Hair Tater or Harry Tater. And so I sometimes call myself in letters to him Herr Augenblick for Wink. And so, it just, something I like to do,
Using words to enchant the world.
Yeah.
It works.
Let me ask you a question. Like at SMU in your English department, do you have this kind of a thing going on?
Yeah. Some years ago, and it's, how you said when you told the Mothra story, you weren't trying to fool anybody.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is often the case with me. I'll just be running on
mm-hmm.
thinking, I'm not trying to get anybody to believe this stuff.
Right.
But the thing is, there's a lot of my biography that does seem almost fantastical, I think, to some of the folks around SMU. I mean, then I'm from a place called Pumpkin Bend.
Right.
And there are just any number of stories I can tell that are the absolute truth.
Right.
That are as weird and colorful as something you'd make up, So I think I was underestimating the extent to which the stuff I was making up sounded just like the true stuff.
Greg, yeah.
So one year I was finished with class a couple of minutes early, and it was right around Easter time, and I asked my students, are y'all going home, and what are you going to, and I asked them what they're going to do, and one of them mentioned an Easter egg hunt, and I said, oh yeah, and I don't know what came over me,
mm-hmm.
but I said, I've heard about that, and I've seen stuff on TV about it, but some people hunt Easter eggs, mm-hmm. and they said, what do you mean you've seen it on TV? What do you do? And I said, well, where I grew up, we would paint watermelons and hide watermelons. And the fact that you don't even have watermelons that time of year is not even a problem for these students, and because they probably had never grown them and didn't think about that. And now all fruits are available year round in the grocery store just about. So they said, well, what in the world are you talking about? Well, I didn't know what I was going to say. So I just started making stuff up, and I said, well, we get there's an old commode that somebody's not using, that's just kind of out. And it actually was the case that there was an old rusty commode out in my backyard. Right. I think Daddy had gotten it from some house. Right. He had torn down some woman with a great name, Wester, that lived in Pumpkin Bend. He had this commode, and he wound up. A guy by the name of Popejoy came and wanted to haggle over it. So see, this is true, right? And sounds like something that you'd be making up. Right. The Popejoy and the Wester and the rusty commode in the backyard. But all that's true. And I said, what we would do is I had an old dip net like you would use in the bio, as we would say, bayou, and we just cut that netting off there and I guess the size of the watermelons would just have to match the size of this dip net. And I said, we would just put a great big watermelon in the dip net, and it would kind of hold it there. And then we would fill that old commode up with house paint and just dip it down in there and kind of paint it that way. And sometimes change the paint out and do it two-tone, and then we'd let them dry, and then we would hide the watermelons, and the little kids would search for them. And they was like, well, where would you hide a great big watermelon like that? And I said, well, sometimes we'd take the baby out of a pram and put it in there where the baby would be and kind of cover it up with the clothes or put it in the chimney top, stuff like that. And as I was saying it, I could see that I was being believed. And so then I just couldn't, I didn't have it in me to turn back. So I just ran with it.
Absolutely.
So I went with it, and then with that same class, so I decided, I was like, I'm going to keep saying weird stuff about watermelons just to see how far this will go. So a very good student had written a poem about superstitions, and she said that you should make a wish on an upturned hem, like of a pair of pants. And I had never heard that one. And I said, has anybody heard that you should make a wish on an upturned hem? And nobody in the room had heard of it. But somebody said, but I have heard that. And pretty soon we were having folklore hour, which was delightful, but we were getting far away from the poem. So, and I wanted to get us back to the poem, but I didn't want to do it in a taskmastery way. So I thought, well, I'll just say something that'll kind of stop this thing dead in its tracks. So I said, yeah, and I've always heard that it's bad luck to drop a watermelon on a newborn. And this guy named Nick, who was a delightful student, he said, you mean like a personal watermelon? Which was a term that had started showing up in the grocery store, the personal watermelon, those little bitty ones. I said, no, I'm talking about, a great big one. And then this one student said, that's not bad luck. That's just cruel and possibly lethal. And but it started kind of going around, and I started hearing stories about this watermelon lore. Other professors would hear about it, and
that is wonderful. Greg.
Stuff like that's going on.
That about getting into something and suddenly realizing you kind of want to pull the plug on it, but that you don't want to embarrass somebody.
Right.
I may or may not have ever told you about this, but this happened right in this room, and I was sitting right down there, and the girl it happened, my victim, was sitting right here. About Shakespeare's 60th sonnet, like as the waves make. Have I ever told you
I don't
that?
think I've heard this.
Okay, well, what happened was the girl's name, she's remained a good friend despite this. And it was in a creative writing class, and there were 6 or 7 people in it. We're right in here. And toward the end of a period one day, I said, talking about metaphors and similes, and I said, like, let's say you wanted to try to talk about time, because who doesn't, I mean, you start trying to write things, and you try to get at this thing in the midst of the utter unfathomable mystery of time. And, you watch writers like Virginia Woolf and Thomas Wolfe and William Faulkner and Marcel Proust, and you see them really trying hard to catch something of that in their words. And, so you just want to talk about time. Who doesn't? So I said, I invite y'all to go out and, write something about it. And I said, of course, if you're going to write about time and try to catch something about it, you need you need an image. You need to liken time to something. So I said, let's see, what could you do? You could just, maybe think about a beach. I'm from Mississippi. I grew up along the beaches. This is the way I might operate on something like this. And I might say, like as the waves make towards the pebbled shore. So now you're going to compare time to waves coming in. And you can see why that would be. And maybe your only worry would be that a lot of people have already done that. Can you enter the list and do as well, or even remotely as well as somebody else? So, like as the waves make towards the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end. So waves and minutes, and each changing place with that which goes before. In sequent toil, all forwards do contend. So you're just gonna see where you can go from there. So I keep expecting to get called. I don't know much about these people. I don't know what all they've had, who they've studied. And I'm thinking this isn't as famous as Let Me Not to the Marriage of True Minds or Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day, but it's one of the pretty famous ones. But these are kids and undergraduates, and I kept waiting for somebody to say, "Oh, dude, shut up! You're quoting Shakespeare. Don't pretend to be writing Shakespeare." But they don't. And after a while, Sally says, "Hey, do you remember what you said? Because I know you're just making this up off the top." Said, "Yeah, I think so." Well, she starts copying it out, and she copies the whole thing out, and I do the whole thing, and I dismiss class. Well, I'm embarrassed. I thought, I'm acting like, and I thought, I'm just gonna let this go away. I'm just going to forget this. They'll forget it. It's just something the teacher said in the class. I'm going to, and I did that for about a week. I just didn't say anything more about it, forgot it. And then I took up their writing journals for that class. And Sally says, I'm feeling really pretty bad about, trying to be a writer. She says, my darn teacher sits down there and just makes up off the top of his head this really good poem. And that, I knew it was confession time. So I confessed to the whole class, and Sally and I got to joking about how we were going to get, both of us were going to be hauled in for plagiarism because she had copied this out and had sent it to somebody. And we had a joke, and I started calling her Jailbird. And she eventually took Latin from me, and she became Forquifera, which is Latin for thief, because she'd stolen this. And then the icing on the cake for this is it turns out Sally's, the father's now divorced the mother and is estranged from Sally, but at the time he was a very charming man, and he was a man who worked for the prison system, for private prisons. So that was part of our joke. Your daddy's going to send us to jail, But that was a classic one of being in the middle of it and really wanting to stop it. But by then, I couldn't imagine any way that would have been anything but cruel to just say, "Oh, I was just fooling with you. That's Shakespeare." And so I didn't, until later when she talked about how she'd been thrown into despair by what her teacher could do just off the top of his head.
Yeah, that reminds me of another great story involving a student in Shakespeare, the old where the bees suck, there suck I.
Oh, God.
Another one where you might have felt a little bad, but also been so delighted.
And that was based on an experience Philip Anderson, Jay's good friend, had, where he taught an old spelling edition of Shakespeare. And there was a girl who was a good, upstanding Christian girl who didn't want to say dirty words, but she was asked to give a report on that song. And she sees that thing that looks like an F. She just bit the bullet. She thought, well, I want to be a good Christian girl, but at the same time, I'm being asked to do this sonnet, or this song. And so she read it with that S appearing to be an F,
This reminds me, some years ago, I found myself in a lot of situations in which somebody would mention a movie and ask me whether I'd seen it. It made me think about you with the idea of you haven't itis, where you haven't read
you
such
haven't
and
read
such.
the Brothers Karamazov, yeah.
And it's like when my friend Melissa Range, who's a fantastic poet, got to grad school, everybody was talking about Meditation at Lagunitas by Robert Hass, and they would say, "Have you read this?" And she said no, and then, you haven't read. She's like, I've read other poems. It's not like you're disqualified as a reader of poetry if you have a chance to cross this one. But anyway, people were forever doing that to me about movies because I didn't grow up close to a movie theater, and my parents didn't watch a lot of movies. There wasn't really much movie watching going on, and so I just didn't get in the habit of watching them. So it's true that I'm woefully film illiterate. But
you have seen more than 3, right?
I've seen a few, But I thought, well, how can I make this fun for me, these moments? And so I started telling everybody, well, I've only seen 3 movies. But my game was, and I started doing this at SMU, and I would tell students all the time, I would say, well, I've only seen 3 movies. But my game was, I would constantly change the first 2 on the list. Those were, so I might say, I've seen The Firm, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, but the third one was always Teen Wolf.
I remember that. So great. That's one of my favorite things that anybody ever did to people by the way of just making things up. I love that one.
And people would have a vague sense, like, I feel like the list is changing, but they, people weren't sure.
Right.
Because the Teen Wolf kind of anchored it.
Right.
Maybe it is always the same.
I could have forgot those others. It might not have been I thought he'd said The Firm last time, but maybe not. Well, never in my life have I had more fun with this kind of nonsense than that day that you and I walked home with Beth Couch and Jessica Coleman. And you had them believing that there were certain passages in the Bible that you were constrained from reading because they were in prose, right?
Right. I could only read the poetry. That was my religion.
And you had those girls were so angry at whoever had been in charge of your religious upbringing. That was wonderful.
And that got out. But I remember, and speaking of your great nicknames, there was a young lady in our creative writing workshop at the time, in which I was a student, named Gunstream Girl.
Oh, yeah.
And I believe it was Gunstream Girl. She had a great idea. I don't know if you remember this, but she turned in a poem to a workshop. And it was titled something like, "To Save My Friend Greg's Life in Case of Inclement Weather." And the whole poem was, "Bridge may ice in cold weather." And she said, because, you need to be able to read that. Because it wasn't just that I couldn't read the Bible, the prose section. It was that I couldn't read anything that wasn't poetry.
Yes.
And so she said, that's one thing you need to be able to read,
right,
and in case there's icy weather.
Absolutely.
So I have made this poetry because I've presented it as poetry. So now you can read that sign without any kind of breach of the faith.
Wonderful.
Well, and the kind of this these kinds of gags, it makes me think of Strove for the makes me think of the movies that.
Yeah. Jay Curlin really did a wonderful thing with that Strove for the pie crust. When we were in Indiana and people were going on about what movies.
This was at a wedding?
Yeah, Doug Hofstadter's wedding. And I brought out Strove for the pie crust. I wanted to one-up everybody, so I brought up a movie that didn't exist as a movie. Nobody had seen it, of course, and they were all dubious. And I remember James Plath, my magician friend, he started to haul out his laptop to look it up, and I knew the jig was fixing to be up with me. And boy, Jay jumped in, and he was my deus ex machina. He said, y'all forget about that Strove for the pie crust. That Johnny's got a bad habit of overrating things. He overrates feminine pulchritude, some books.
Frost poems.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Frost poems. And really, this Strove for the pie crust, I saw it on Johnny's recommendation. I wish I hadn't. And James actually put up his laptop. I mean, that could have gotten him more interested, but that really just sort of relegated strove for the pie crust to the realm of movies, actual, although crummy movies, and the subject was dropped and my cover was not blown. That's not saying they believed it, but I did not have James Plath going after it, on his laptop.
So what was happening is that people were sitting around talking about their favorite movies from the year, but you got the sense it was all about finding one that would be obscure.
Yeah, because we were talking about current movies, and it was almost like all these were pleasant people, but it's like in a way were invisible points being awarded to the person who, like if, I think there were 8 or 9 of us gathered around. So and it was like golf, if you could come up with one that only 2 people had seen or one. So I decided to beat them all, I'd find one that they'd never seen.
Do you remember how you put it, or like, did you use your voice to make it seem
Yeah, I think I did. I forget exactly. But that's one thing I wanted to tell you about this kind of narrative nonsense we're talking about. When I'm really trying to sell a Whopper and I've got time, I've got a ploy that really is pretty good, Greg. And what it is to be Johnny Wink. And what I mean by that is to be telling a story that's going to have a whopper, but be telling it in the Winkian manner. And that is with a lot of digressions and a lot of hemming and hawing and not getting to the point. So that you've got the person to whom you're listening. And I generally do this if it's just one-on-one. Who's listening to you will say, okay, but what about the guy you were wanting to tell me about? Because I'll keep, and that's the easiest thing in the world. It comes so naturally to me, to get off.
Right.
But I'm doing it on purpose with this. And so by the time the point that I spring to Whopper, this is so the way Johnny Wink is. This is so true to life, that along with that comes and it's a little bit like what you're talking about with the watermelons. Some of it's true, the names of these people, they're actually real names, So you're melding the truth, but one truth that is very effective for me is this is just the way Johnny Wink talks, and that gives it a air of verisimilitude, So and I've seen that work really a number of times on friends of mine, where something that if I just told it in 2 minutes, just making that up.
Yeah, exactly.
Tell it in the Winkian way, and I got a shot at least, I got a shot.
I remember that night that I brought my friend Lisa to town, and we went out to eat with your son Gene. He told a great story when we got back to your house. And we should confirm this with Gene, because I was questioning the other day, because there was one detail in his story that I kind of want to play with, not to improve. It's not one of those where I'm trying to improve upon it, because what he's did, I don't think it could be improved upon, but I just like imagining the various details that could be slotted in that spot in the story.
Right.
So we went out with you and Lisa, my friend Lisa from New Hampshire, and I and Gene and I went out to eat catfish. And I remember that night we were sitting there at the catfish place here in Arkadelphia, Arkansas, and when we got seated, a man who may have been the owner or the manager came over and said, or you folks make yourselves comfortable. Faith will be your waitress. She'll be over in a minute. And when he left, Gene and I looked at each other and thought, Faith will be your waitress. It's a beautiful line. And then that wound up being in a poem of mine in my book, A Horse with Holes in It. I never forgot that, Faith will be your, it's just so resonant, so lovely.
Yeah.
But then we went back to y'all's house, and Gene said, well, I'm going to have to go. And Lisa said, oh, well, what are you about to go do? And he said, well, there's a special softball game they have every year that I go to, and it's and here's the part where I've changed it so many times, I'm not sure which one is.
Yeah.
I think he said human beings bat, but then it was some animal would run the bases, and I think it may have been a turkey. Turkeys run the bases. It was something utterly absurd.
Yeah.
But I wonder whether Gene remembers and knows which animal he actually said, because I've played with it so much till I don't even know.
I'll write it. I will absolutely.
Something about turkeys run the bases, and it was one of those. Lisa bought it. It was something about the way he told it. He sold it, and it was because, and I think he had a ploy too, which was, I'm not even trying to. It's like, well, I gotta go, y'all.
Right,
He was, well, it's a softball. Well, what kind of soft? She's kind of, pressing him for information, and he acted like he was just kind of, handing over the mundane facts of the thing.
I absolutely love teaming up with Gene. I don't see him that much anymore, but boy, he and we make a great team.
I bet.
And somebody else that's also mighty good at this kind of thing is Jay. Jay Curlin's good at it too. But Eli Craner is also somebody that's really. And Eli, one of the things that's very moving to me because of my deep love for both of y'all, I've gradually realized that Eli, and I used to tell him this about you all the time, and it kind of sneaked up on me one day. Eli's in your league when it comes to listening. He is one of the great listeners. And I've always thought of you, as you're just my exemplar for a man who actually has the capacity to listen. And what a powerful thing it is. And not just that it helps you with your art, but just it helps the world to have somebody listen. There was in the 1960s, I guess it could have been the 50s, I was reading a lot of novels, best-selling novels back then. And there was a writer named Taylor Caldwell. I think Taylor might have been a woman. I'm not sure. But he or she, I think she, wrote a novel called The Listener. And I really don't remember much about the book, but I remember being very taken by it because her point was somehow the listener in this had magical powers that were based upon the ability to listen well. And since it's not something that comes easy, to most of us, or natural even, then someone who either by dint of nature or nurture trains himself. I mean, like with you, I don't know what to make of it. I sometimes think it's just, Greg so delights in the cosmos that he's in that he really wants to pay attention to every aspect of it that comes his way, But could you talk to me about, was that in any way a matter of training, or what would you attribute your capacity for this to? In any event, Eli's really got it too, and it gradually dawned on me. And one day I said to him, "Yeah, I've always been talking to you about Greg Brownville about this, but you do the same thing," and he really does.
Yeah. Now that you say that, I think about times I've been with him. There are a lot of people around, and a lot of times he kind of sits back and he just takes it in.
He's an excellent listener, man.
Yeah.
Oh, gosh. No, but how about just?
I think for me, it's maybe two things, with one of them being the main thing and the other one being important, but not quite as important as the first. I think it's a love of language, especially as incarnated in the human voice. I'm obsessed with language, and I like it better in the air than anywhere else.
Right.
I like to hear the human voice, and it's like an incarnation to me, like the word becomes flesh in the Bible, or something like that with speech, that the word is enfleshed. The intention of language is enfleshed in actual words. And I remember as a child thinking that words were my favorite toys. I remember lying in bed one night as a little kid thinking, kind of feeling like I was getting away with something. I thought, am taking so much pleasure in language. This stuff is free. It's not, nobody can take it away from me. Yeah. I'm going to be like this the rest of my life. It's like as if you had won the lottery, but it was the lottery that would never stop sending you money or something. I just thought, this is going to be this is going to be my joy. Yeah. As long as I'm on this planet. Yeah. And so there's that. And then in addition to that, there's just curiosity about people, like what makes them tick, like what are they thinking about, how do they behave, and so when somebody's talking, you're getting both of those things. You're getting the language,
right,
and you're also just you're in the presence of the wondrousness of another being that's over there just doing things and saying things and has a whole set of concerns and preoccupations and thoughts and emotions. And so I think it's just that feeling of the gift of other people's communication, their conversation.
Right. One of the things I was thought of as you were telling me that, when you were talking about all of this is coming your way forever and there's so much of it. And I was thinking, not only do you have all these voices of actual people out there in the world, but you have these geniuses who can figure out a way to fashion all of this. I mean, take it absolutely from life and then offer up yet another delightful version of it. And what I'm thinking of right now is how Jack Butler has recently gotten me onto these novels by a guy named Donald Westlake, who is dead now, but he in the middle and the second half of the 20th century and on into our current century, he wrote a whole bunch of books, and I'm especially taken by some featuring a guy named Dortmunder, who's a criminal, and they're comic books with capers, but the way people talk in his books. And Jack and I are like a couple of two septuagenarian kids in a candy store now. Jack got me onto Westlake, and now our letters back and forth are just swapping jewels from Westlake's books. And we really are. We're like a couple of kids with playing cards or baseball cards. It's just
That's beautiful.
That same supreme pleasure. Oh my God!
To make something on the page be so alive that it is heard. It's as if it is in the air,
and it came out of the world. It's the romantic phrase of Wordsworth: half created and half perceived.
Yeah.
I mean, Westlake, Elmore Leonard, any great writer of dialogue needed the world for this. It's like Stevens says, you can do anything you want with a blackbird. You can see a blackbird in however many ways you want, but you do have to have the blackbird as your baseline, and they needed, the patois that is the conversation of real life. And then they worked their own particular magic, with that. And gosh.
Well, that's one of the reasons I'm interested in this particular medium of the podcast, is that it's the voice.
Right.
And that's why I wanted to talk to you, because I find you to be such a magical conversationalist. I think this is it's an art form that is not always appreciated as an art form. We don't think of it in the same way as something that's committed to the page.
Right.
Partly because it's one of those you had to be there. Like, I remember when I sat with Johnny in his office on such and such a day, and he told me this thing that has just gleamed and glimmered away in my heart ever since. It's, there, and the podcast is a way of sharing the joy of conversation.
Right. I remember Will Sondheim, Doug and Amy's younger son, did a podcast with me one time, and I remember how much fun I had with that. And that was based on he actually wanted the story, the quirky way in which after 30 years, a second book of mine got into print. And the way it happened was, I don't know if I ever told you the Great Gray Mole story about the guy. I was watching a TV program called The Washington Journal, and I would watch it in the morning. This is going back years ago, 15 years or so. And one morning, the interviewer had a guy on who had this kind of crackpot idea about Texas seceding from the Union. And he was going to demonstrate this somehow with 3 empty Coke bottles, or he'd maybe put water in them. And what I remember was it's early in the morning, Susan was still in bed, and I was fixing to come off to school, and I was sitting there drinking coffee and listening to this guy. And, and this water bottle is this and this and this, just this kind of crackpot thing. And then that phone started ringing, people started calling in. And boy, everybody was just hating on that guy. And I mean, just, this guy, what an ass he is and what an idiot and this and that and the other. And he's just sitting there, in front of a camera with with his odd idea and his water bottles, and all of a sudden, Greg, I just got so sick at heart, man. I was sick at heart. And I thought, but in the middle of that being sick at heart, of course, the zany in me, one of Beth has, fought back with nicknames, and she's got nicknames for me too. And one of hers for me is Zany, the Italian, for Johnny, and a nickname that has to do with zany. But anyway, so in the middle of this being sick at heart, the zany was still operating in me, and I said to the TV set, and nobody else, because nobody else was in there, maybe a cat, I said, man, this kind of shit wouldn't have gone on, this kind of hating. Boy, back when great gray moles ran things, when they ruled the earth, it wouldn't have gone on. So I came to school, and I wrote a poem called Great Gray Moles. And the idea is just this, at the end, I end up with a guy, and, with the water bottles and all the phone, all the hating on him, and just end it with, great gray moles wouldn't have let this go down, I don't know what great gray moles would have done, but they wouldn't have allowed that kind of thing. So I write this goofy poem of mine up, and I send it to a former student of mine who was going to school in Inverness, in St. Andrews in Scotland. And he just so happened to have a friend who was connected with a very small press, and this guy, John, has a wonderful Greek last name. I can't remember it right now, and a really nice guy. And they both take a shine to this poem. So next thing I know, Josh is saying, would you send me, just every time you write a goofy poem, send it. And I'm going to show it to John. Paz Diagora, something like that. And the upshot of all of this was they liked enough of those that I ended up having a second little modest book 30 years after the first one. But it always is all based on that thing of great gray moles and just seeing this guy being hated on. And then came the sickness of heart, and then came the zaniness, after that. And anyway, Will Sondheim got me to do a podcast in which I just told what I just told you. Mm-hmm. And I remember looking at it later and liking it and thinking that was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And I like doing that, So that's why I was thrilled, of course, when you got in touch with our doing a couple of these, the two of us,
I was going to ask you, and this is something that I am writing about in that last stanza of the poem Mystery. I've noticed that in a number of mythologies, there's the idea that language is that either the universe is language, mm-hmm. or that language is bringing the universe into being, mm-hmm. like in Genesis, or the West African idea that Mawu writes in her secret language the day, and then Legba, her son, who knows the magic language, right. delivers it into the world, and now it is the day.
Absolutely.
Why do you have any ideas about why language figures so prominently in those stories? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, from Om to Amen, the sacred books agree. The world is words. Yeah, we've got right there. In the beginning was the word of all things, the word, and speak the word only. I think of a great song that's got that phrase, speak the word only, and sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me. And that's always spoken in context. If somebody's really saying it in the world, it's being said by somebody who's just been hurt by words.
Yep.
And it's whistling in the graveyard, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will hurt you. And sometimes they'll heal you. And, speak the word only. And so I can see why that's the single thing that makes us, sets us away, from the other creatures. We have this thing of human language. Not that they don't have communication too, but, and at the beginning of Metamorphoses, Ovid makes his distinction. The thing that he says sets us apart from the beasts is that we stand up and look at the sky. And that's his motif all the way through the poem. He's going to find his place among the stars. He talks about the stellification of the emperors at the end. But we have the other animals, they look to their mother, the earth, And then, of course, in some religions, that will be the great veneration too, because it won't be the sky so much. The snake, why is the snake sacred in some cultures? All of it's on the ground. It's it's got the real contact. We're just hanging by a thread when we, stand on our feet. But for Ovid there at the beginning of it, as a man can, and what does he do when he looks up there? He thinks. And what does he do after he thinks? He words his thoughts. And so a lot of reasons I could see that in the beginning would be the word then. Although from a scientific point of view, in the beginning, the word would have nothing to do with it, It would be gases and things, molecules blowing up in a big bang,
When you think about our relationship with language, we are writers, we are readers, we are characters in the cosmic poem. Right. Do you think about yourself as working in those different modes, that sometimes in life you're a character in the story, in the poem, and you're really experiencing the day that way, but in other moments you're sort of the reader of the
absolutely. And in my struggle with grief since Susan died, I keep, having this same sense that I get in trouble when, and a lot of people, this is almost trite. It's so common to the human experience, but I'm at my best if I'm working a Sudoku puzzle or getting a big kick out of a Donald Westlake novel or sitting here talking with you. I'm at my best when, in one sense, even though I'm being introspective now, I'm out of myself.
Yeah.
And yet I can't do that always. The ego dies hard, and I'm still subject to its whims and to my seeing myself, somehow in relation to others. And I don't know. I know when I'm at my best, and I go back and forth between being at my best. That's I think one reason that in the rough times I've had in my life, when Susan and I had a stormy period in our marriage in the 70s that went on for several years, in the time since I've lost Susan, a great refuge for me has been, and down through the years, has been a classroom. Because weirdly enough, I feel like I get out of myself when I'm in a classroom, because the point in a classroom is a subject. Today it was the opening motions of getting my students ready for the big grammar exam. And it had everything to do with, something I know my students aren't as fascinated as I am, and we discussed it last time. It's the missing relative pronoun, and all the neat ways it can go missing, and all the little, if you miss the train I'm on, I was working on that one with them today. The train I'm on, I said, look at this. You got you got 4 letters. You got I''M''O''N. You got a 4-letter, 2-word expression, and it's a whole clause. Mm-hmm. It's a whole clause with a subject and a verb and a direct object. And the direct object is invisible, inaudible in the sentence. It could be there. You could say, if you miss the train that I'm on. And so, man, when I'm there, I'm in the flow. I'm the guy with the unpronounceable name who wrote the great thing about flow. That at least I can't pronounce it right this minute. Mm-hmm. And that's flow.
Yeah, and I love coming back to visiting your classes from time to time, because it does my heart good just to see a classroom that is that joyful. I don't think I've ever met, and I've known some fantastic teachers, and I've had the great good fortune of being taught by some great teachers. Not that many, but but I don't think I've ever seen anybody who has the kind of joy that you seem to take in students and being in the class. There's such joy to it, and the relationships you have with your students are so rich and alive and deep. It's a beautiful thing to see. And
I learned something. This is a strange thing, but I learned a very important thing from a guy who was not a good teacher. He was my freshman English teacher at the University of Southern Mississippi. And he was, his name was Mr. Eubanks. And the reason he wasn't a good teacher is Mr. Eubanks really didn't want to teach his subject. He wanted other things. But the thing that he was very good at, and I'm grateful to him, and I remember this, he wanted to create a world in that class, and he wanted to build up a world. Now, my thinking about it has been that is great if you want, and that's what I try for every time. And I have failed abysmally at times, and I've succeeded really well at times. And I've done, most of it's been somewhere in the middle, but the subject's got to be at the heart of it. And if I'm teaching mythology, that's got to be the subject. And we can do all kinds of things around that,
Mm-hmm.
but that's got to be at the heart of it, or you're not doing your job, and they shouldn't pay you.
Well, I feel like people, whether they showed up this way or not, for the most part, while they're in your classes and after they leave your classes, experience and understand the joy and magic of language. You have a way of awakening people to that. And I think almost everybody has some of that. It's there to be discovered.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what all your secrets are, but when I come to one of your classrooms, I see a room full of people who are loving words and just delighting.
Yeah. I'll give you a good example of a kid that I fell in love with, a boy named James Carpenter. And he was a nice kid. I mean, we'd never had anything but a good time together. This was in World Lit back in the spring of the last of this school year, or the previous school year. And one of the things that I've put into the class is the slab text business. Well, James began to pride himself on the fact that he would hear a student say something, or there would be something in one of the books we were reading, one of the stories we were reading. And, he would, and so he'd start writing these down, and he became known as Slab Master. And I finally gave it over to him. So he would say, okay, we've got 6 today. We're going to have to vote on them. And he just ran the slab show. And he would come up, he would mine. It was beautiful, because I'd even forget that I'd said this or that student over there. But he said, hey, yeah, what Harrison said today, this would be great out of context. And I just love the fact that the guy, converted into a lover of slab text,
And just for the benefit of people who may be listening, how does that work? You get this game that you play with them with the slab.
Yeah. So what we do is, with 2 minutes left in the period, or if we're having a quiz at the end with 12 minutes left, we set aside 2 minutes for slabbing, and then we have 10 minutes for the quiz. But if we don't have a quiz, it's then 2 minutes before. I then say, well, does anyone have a suggestion for a slab text? Tom Offenberg and a student of ours named Mike Sutton had a shirt made for me that says Slab Commander Wink, which I sometimes wear to class. And I'm the commander, except I turned it over to James Carpenter last year. And I will have the final say, but like Sydney Whitfield is a great student of mine. She's in grammar. And she'll say, well, I've written down 3 today, and then we decide which of the 3 to send out.
And you started calling it that because they're big and they look like slabs?
I guess. I guess they just reminded me of a slab,
That's a great word.
Or something. But a couple of years after I started calling them that, I was reading a novel by Ian McEwan, one of my favorites, and is set in the 1990s. I think it's called Enduring Love. And somewhere in the late 90s, because these things have just started coming on, Tom Offenberg, in a trip in Scotland when I was with him and Susan and Jean, I remember his saying, look, everybody's got these things, and these were, up to their ears. And Tom just couldn't believe that. That was 1999. He came home in the fall and bought one, had one ever after that. But then in Enduring Love, when these are just coming in, So, and one reason you know that novel was written in 1997, say rather than 2015, is that a bunch of people are out in the English countryside and a balloon gets away. And one person happens to have one of these things. And that says to you, it couldn't be 2010, you know. And sure enough, it was the late 90s. And he, in describing it, he describes it as a slab. But I didn't get it from him. That's my point, you know, is that I came up with that. And then to see that the great Ian McEwan had done that, I felt happy by association, I'll tell you.
Well, we are almost to the end of our time because you said 6:30, and
right.
we're right there. So one thing that will be very quick that you told me last time is about the what the young lady said about whom.
Oh, gosh. You know, Greg, occasionally I do something that I call a who-whom seminar. And I just send this out. I'll send this. I don't have an official mailing list anymore. I threw that away because I sometimes I'll get pretty frenetic and I'll send a lot of, and I thought there are a lot of people on this list who are just too polite to ask off. So nowadays what I do, I still broadcast things, but I'll just, I don't go by, I just say, well, let's see, I think Greg might want to hear that. Okay, good, Jay. And, you know, and I'll come up with 20 or 25 people. And every once in a while, I'll do something called the Who-Whom Seminar. And what I'm interested in there is just, how would my friends, you know, would they use a who or a whom here? That's basically what it is. And one day I was just talking about this in a class and this whole business of who-whom. And I had a girl say, I was just going around saying, would you ever use a whom? Some of them would say, in writing, maybe, not really in speaking. And until I got to that wonderful, feisty girl who said, I tell you how I feel about whom. I wouldn't date a guy who uses the word whom. And I think I actually said to her something like, in speech or in writing? And she said, I think she said, I was thinking about speech, but yeah, if I saw it in the paper, I don't think I'd date him either, you know. But I thought, what a neat aesthetic, you know.
Well, thank you, Johnny. This has been nothing but a delight, and
now,
I hope
Are you going to actually go home tonight?
No, I'm going to just go back to Dallas. Yeah.
Oh man, you going to be all right doing that?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
I'm a night driver from way back.
Good for you, man. But I
hope we could do this again. I really love doing these conversations, and so many times I've wished that I could go and listen to these stories that you've told me, and now I'll be able to.
You say the word, man. What a beautiful setup you brought up here. This is great. It feels to me like we're succeeding, probably. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're going to have good audio on this.
Okay,
one.
good.
Well, thank you, Johnny.
Good deal, man. Thank you.